Welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast Live. We're back after a bit of a break. I've had a break from broadcasting the podcast for 3 weeks for the first time since I launched it in September, and a little bit of a break from the live broadcasts as well. So welcome back if you're joining again. Welcome if you're joining for the first time. If it is your first time joining the Connected Leadership Podcast Live, the Connected Leadership Podcast goes out twice a week on a Monday and a Thursday, and what I've started doing over the last few weeks is broadcasting it live onto LinkedIn, Facebook and YouTube, and that's where you come in. So I've forgotten to open my comments thread, so now my comments are open. If you are watching live on LinkedIn, Facebook or YouTube and you want to get involved in the conversation, please feel free. And all the tech working well, which every time something goes wrong, but all the tech working well, I'll see your comments and we'll bring you into the conversation. Wherever you are, tell me where you are in the world as well. I hope you're getting better weather than us. It's like November outside. It's grey, it's windy. The only thing we're lacking that makes November weather worthwhile is the rain, because then I've got an excuse to put Guns N' Roses on. But it's absolutely dreary outside. The plus side of that, sounding like an absolute miser, is that it stops all the kids playing outside while I'm recording a podcast, and it makes it all a little bit quieter. We get less of the background noise, or at least here's hoping. So you don't want to hear me rambling on about the rain. You're probably curious to hear about my guest today, and curious would be the right state to be in, because we're going to talk all about curiosity. My guest is Dr. Alison Horstmeyer, and Alison is someone with a blue chip career behind her who now explores human relationships and curiosity in particular. And in terms of this podcast, the focus being on professional relationships and its connection to leadership, I think curiosity is a state of mind and a skill set that feeds both. But you may wonder why. So that's exactly what Alison is here to share with us. So Alison, welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. It's absolutely my pleasure.
And I should add that, I talk about tech issues every single time. We've got it again. Alison can't hear me on here, so we've got a phone call running in sync. So if you hear any lags between the answers, it seems to be working quite well at the moment. But any lagging in the answers, it's not because it's late in the day, because it's not for Alison. As you might have guessed, she's not based in the UK, but it's just because of the phone line. So Alison, I'm curious to know, why curiosity? How did you get involved in studying curiosity?
Yeah, so it was during my latter part of my career where, I had a wonderful time working with international sales teams or cross-functional teams, and we had great success. But in that process, I really saw a lot of anxiety and complacency and stress around me, and I wanted to do something about it. I was always really fascinated how we show up, how we connect our mind to our body, and behavioral science, essentially. And so I went back to school and I immersed myself in many different disciplines and modalities. And it was during my mindfulness research that I was like, oh, wow, maybe if you're curious, then you can't be anxious. And Andy, that was incredibly naive. But I thought I had something, and it led me down this beautiful, rich journey, studying curiosity and having me come back to anxiety, because anxiety is an indelible part of curiosity, and it's really how we manage and cope with that anxiety and stress along the way that supports our curiosity. And so I really found that there's such a richness to curiosity, and we have such an oversimplified definition and operationalization of it in the workplace because we don't understand the multidimensionality of it. And that there is the not knowing, exploration, openness, and then the stress tolerance dimension is a newer dimension just coming out in the research that really highlights that aspect of managing our anxiety along the way. And in our workplaces and in our relationships, that dimension tends to be the lower performing facet.
It's really interesting because obviously I've planned our conversation and the sort of areas I want to talk about based on the professional relationships aspect and the
Yeah.
leadership and how that relates to leadership. But you've really got me gripped in terms of how does curiosity play out in terms of impacting our anxiety and our stress levels.
Yeah. So a lot of the work I do with executives is really connecting to our core values because in my work and my research, and this is also emergent in other research, there's a connection between our values and how we're curious, and also our self concept, how we perceive ourselves. So it's really interesting. If you look at the values research, there are anxiety based values, such as conformity. Conformity actually has an inverse relationship to openness to change. So the more conformity, the lower openness to change. The more conformity, the lower the well being. Actually has an inverse relationship to well being. So our values really matter in terms of how we are going to be able to manage and cope with our anxiety, because our values actually inform our behavior more so than facts and reason. And so, perfect example, I just worked with an executive, female executive, superstar in healthcare, and she really wants to own her seat at the table. And she was going into a meeting with her advisory board, and she was bringing forward a really sticky issue. And she's gotten really clear on her values and how she wants to show up. And there was an intentionality that she wanted to have about how she showed up in that meeting. And I asked her to reflect on how that meeting went afterwards. And she sent me an email that said that the meeting went incredibly well because I was authentically curious. I tampered down the need to impress, because when we have to impress, our anxiety goes up. We have to perform, we have to be perfect. So she tampered that down. And she said that the advisory board said that she was courageous for bringing the topic forward. And courage is one of her core values. And she said it was great that they referenced her values without even knowing it. And so there are tools for us to use to be able to really support us in that process of anxiety, because Andy, the situations that are ambiguous, complex, uncertain, those have the highest potential to give us new information and new experiences. And if we don't lean into them, then we're not going to build the reference points to feel supported and to build the resilience going forward. So if we're always holding on to certainty, it's an illusion, right? Things are changing too fast. We're going to get left behind, and then the anxiety is going to go up even more.
I love this. I have to tell you, all my questions, and I told you this might happen, the questions that I sort of had planned are getting ripped up and thrown out the window. We'll come back to them, I'm sure. But what you may or may not realise is a lot of what you've shared to me is so closely allied to what I wrote about in my last book, because my last book is called Just Ask. And I was talking about being vulnerable, but in terms it's being curious. And what really struck me in that example you shared is this authentically curious notion, because it's not about, okay, I need to be seen to be curious, I need to be seen to be inquisitive, so therefore I'll have a list of questions prepared. I always say that, people ask me what can I ask people at a networking event when I meet them for the first time, and I said, look, there are books that give you a list of questions to ask people at a networking event, and if you ask them, you sound like someone who's read a book with a list of questions to ask someone at a networking event. It's not authentic and it's not true. But that authentically curious and the courage that comes with that is key. And for me, if I can reframe in my own words what you're saying, just to check we're on the same page, and how I see it fitting together with the work that I do, is that you're saying that the conformity element is where I talk about looking good. We have to look strong. We have to look like we've got it together, that we know the answers, and that we're on the same page as everyone else. And that prevents us from asking for help. In your terms, it prevents us from being curious. And if we can let go of that and ask questions where we're not sure and explore and seek to understand, as you say, lean into that curiosity, then that anxiety is going to reduce because we can be more authentically ourselves and be more confident in what we're doing. Would that be a fair summation of what you've said to date?
Yeah, that's really a great summary, and I can also share from my research, my study participants, when they were able to let go of their preconceived notions, their biases, social norms, and really open up the parameters of exploration. I had one study participant, he's a president of a hospital, and he said, people felt run over by me. So what I did, decided to do that in every meeting, I would go in and I would assume I didn't know.
Yeah.
And then that opened up the dialogue. But in opening up the dialogue and opening up the exploration, my study participants actually felt liberated. And when they had to be, quote, strategic, perfect, and on, they felt really constricted, and the anxiety went up. So it almost seems paradoxical. By letting go everything that we know, we actually open ourselves up to actually being innately human, Andy, right?
Yeah.
Like we're able to
Completely.
see, they said they were able to connect not only to their authentic selves, but connect better to others. And we know in the research that curiosity is connected to empathy. We also know that those that are curious are less aggressive when provoked, less judgmental, less critical. And we also see in the research that curiosity is a gateway to higher levels of collaboration and trust.
Which goes so much towards the power of professional relationships, because that's exactly
Yes.
what you're looking to achieve from that. So just to finish on that particular point, did you look in the research in terms of the connection between curiosity and vulnerability? Because it sounds to me as if you're almost describing the same thing.
There was an element of that came forward. I call it personal exposure because the exposure came in different ways depending on the context. So curiosity can be contextual. And there was definitely an element of the aspect of wanting to lean in, but we have a cognitive appraisal that immediately happens before we activate our curiosity, which is, oh gosh, this looks really unfamiliar, complex, or ambiguous, like something new, right? We call it a violation of expectations. Something happens that you didn't expect, right? So you're going into the unknown. And the second appraisal is, do I have what it takes to cope with the stress along the way? And even how am I going to integrate what I'm going to find? So there is a level of feeling like you have to let go of some control, and that's inherently being vulnerable.
And that's where the courageous element that you talked about before really shines through. So let's flip the tables a little bit. You've talked about the impact on the curious person of being curious. What about the impact on the people that they are talking to? How does the I want to say listener, but that's the wrong term. But the conversation partner's experience differ with someone who is curious compared to someone who is direct.
So it goes back to what you were saying before about how you were showing up, right? Are we showing up as the expert or the explorer? So, right, the expert is having an agenda, leaning in to prove that they're right, listening to win, listening to fix. You can be inquisitive, but you can also weaponize questions, right, Andy?
Yeah.
Even why, Andy? That doesn't sound so great and inviting. And our expert really is operating from a lot of assumptions and our biases. So biases such as confirmation bias or framing bias or status quo bias. Those are, our mental shortcuts that we love to go to because we love certainty. However, if we show up as the explorer, we're actually leaning in to help get it right, not to be right. And we're really deferring judgment, and we are looking for new information. We actually are not just perspective taking, but perspective seeking. And so the invitation is, how can you ask open-ended questions? Those typically start with a how or a what. And you're really interested in multi-framing. So reframing is such a powerful tool, right? And we want to be able to look at things in different ways and really open up our perspectives and how we're thinking of things. And so a great question is, what am I missing? Why do we believe what we do, and how could we be wrong? We're so focused on being right. And so if we can show and model that we're interested in helping to get it right, it's really an invitation to the other person to contribute and have a more inclusive conversation. This is why there's so much conversation now around building psychological safety.
It's interesting for me to hear you talk about the expert versus the explorer. As someone whose business is based on expertise, one of the easy traps to fall into is to turn up and deliver the same expertise wherever you go and assume that the audience knows less than you. And it's a very dangerous place to be in. And it's somewhere I've fallen down, in the past, certainly. And I know that I spent this morning developing or finalising 2 programs that I'm running over the next week. And in both cases, they're both at very senior levels where what I teach, I would almost expect people to know. So my focus has been on moving them away from a talk, a presentation, and into a conversation.
Yes.
And in fact, I've got an hour masterclass that I'm running next week. And I would say 3/4 of an hour of it is the group conversing, whether it's through polls or breakout discussions or chats, it's remote. It's as much asking for their opinion. Then I've got certain things where, okay, here's certain things I think you need to know, but I'm holding them in hand. And if the conversation goes a different way, need to be able to adapt to that. And that's been a journey for me, because as a speaker, I found that as a trainer, I was speaking too much. And when I shifted it, and it's still a journey for me, but when I shifted to, on a very basic level, my model was, I will share this point and then you can break out and discuss what I've shared with you. And I turn that around to, what's your experience and take of this? Then feed it back to me and I will then share a take on what you've done. I found that the engagement levels turned. So even when my job is expertise, it pays to be an explorer instead.
Yeah. Shifting from expert to explorer, we go from me to we. I mean, it's really that simple. And I'm not saying you can't bring your expertise to the table. You have amazing expertise to bring to the table, but bring in a way that's in the service of the collective and not in service of you.
Absolutely. So there has to be a line somewhere. And I remember years ago, I was making more effort on sales calls. You said you used to work with salespeople, and I think curiosity is a tremendous skill that is lacking in a lot of salespeople. Who, I remember cold calling in my 20s and just being given a pitch to read out and rebelling because I couldn't stand that much silence at the other end of the line while I read through my pitch without asking a question and engaging the other person in conversation. So I think curiosity is generally lacking in sales, or traditionally lacking in sales. But I remember, being really focused on asking questions first before I came up with a solution, even if I felt I knew what the solution was straight away. And I remember with one potential client, they interrupted me on about my 4th question and said, I feel like I'm being interrogated. So there's a line there, and I think that comes down to authentic questioning and authentic curiosity to a degree. And equally, with what we've just talked about, the expert versus explorer, there's potentially a danger where people hire you as an expert and they say, hold on, why are you asking us for all of the answers? So, how do you know where to draw the line between being curious and then presenting your perspective and your take on things?
We work on this with executives in terms of executive presence, right? And I love the part that you said about making it a conversation, because that, if you frame it that way, then the element of interrogation comes down. And it's really about how are we aligning our agendas and bringing all the perspectives forward. And as your expertise, you're looking for information, and then it's up to you to synthesize what you heard and express a point of view in order to move the conversation along. So you're not keep gunning and gunning and gunning. There's a strategy to the questions because you're trying to get to a certain understanding and a mutual understanding, and then you're checking that as understanding because you're getting the assumptions on the table, right? I mean, the the biggest challenge is we are all having our narratives going on. You have a narrative right now as I'm talking to you. I have a narrative. And so it's like, how do we break through the narratives and have clarity about what really we're trying to solve, let go of past experiences that may inform kind of the interaction that you're currently having. But it is on us to move the conversation forward. And one way to do that is you've got to be a really good synthesizer and then
Excellent.
checking that.
I'm just a quick break from the interview to say I know that there are people watching online. I can see that on my screen. You're all being very quiet today, and I'm curious to know who you are. So say hello in the comments, and if you've got any questions for Alison, if you've got any perspective on what we're sharing, please do share them as well, and I'll be keeping an eye open for those. So, Alison, let's move this and look at the leadership and the professional relationships connection with curiosity, and I think a lot of it has come out already in what you've shared and what you've discussed. But one of the things that comes out a lot when I talk about the importance of leaders being vulnerable, I think is similar with the importance of leaders being curious, coming back to that alignment again. People look to leaders, or I guess this is a question rather than a statement, don't people look to their leaders to have the answers and not have things the other way around? And how does curiosity fit with being a good leader?
I think, we're no longer in the industrial revolution, we're in the digital age. And the definition of leadership has changed pretty dramatically. And we're also, Andy, in what we call a VUCA environment, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And if we are looking at leadership to have vision and to hold the North Star and to motivate and inspire and align against that vision, basically to outline the what and the why, and the organization is there to figure out the how and to enable the how. I'll give you a couple examples to contextualize what I'm talking about. So I just read an article of the CHRO of Novartis, and he was talking about how they tackled crisis during the pandemic. They had to move pretty quickly when borders shut down and they couldn't ship materials. And he said, the old way would have been to have 3 experts tell 110,000 people what to do. So essentially, the team support the manager. They actually flipped that on their head, and they said the manager is there to support the team. And the leaders who said, this is the direction or the vision we need to go, and I have no clue how we're going to solve for it. What are your ideas? Those were the teams that innovated and were able to solve the complex issues. Also, data out of Spencer Stewart, the recruitment firm, they looked at CEOs off of the S&P 500 for 20 years. Rookie CEOs outperformed experienced CEOs on growth. It's great to have an experienced CEO for cost cutting, but if you have complex, ambiguous, hairy problems to solve, the rookie CEOs did so well because they didn't have a playbook. They didn't have a rule of thumb. They asked questions, they explored, and even the rookie CEOs that were successful 2 times on the second company, they threw out the old playbook, went in not knowing, asked questions, and exploring. And I can tell you from personal experience with coaching executives that this is a theme I see all the time when they are like, I don't have time for vision and strategy. It's because they're working in the business instead of
Yeah.
on the business. They're so in the weeds, fixing and reacting, not coaching and developing. And then as we move through the coaching engagement, they'll have this aha, they're like, oh my gosh, my team is doing it so much better than I ever would have. I just heard that last week. And they realize they have to be really accountable for holding the North Star and laddering to that North Star and providing the connection for their organization to, why are they doing what they're doing?
So you talk about the VUCA environment, the volatile, uncertain environment, and how curiosity is so much more important to get across, to get beyond these challenges that we face. I guess the best example of this is the most obvious one over the last year and a bit, which is the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns and the travel bans and the changes in our working environments. When you look, first of all, at governments and governmental responses globally to those challenges, and then you look at the way organisations have adapted. Have you seen examples of where clearly curiosity has been lacking, and that shows in the response, and examples where curiosity has played a key role? And I apologise, I haven't. That's just come to me as a question. I didn't prep you for that, and I might be putting you on the spot. But if you haven't got any examples, that's absolutely fine. But it would be really interesting to know if there's examples you've picked up of either state.
Um, well, I think the companies that were ready for change. So let me back up a couple of points. So there's research that shows that CEO curiosity has a direct impact on the strategic orientation of a company.
Mm.
And so the more curious the CEO is, the better that a company is not only at maximizing their current resources, but they're equally as good as exploiting new avenues in preparation to exploit future resources. We call this ambidexterity. And I would say those companies that were ready with telemedicine, right? They were able to really pivot and support the community, because before we had the pandemic, I can tell you in healthcare, people weren't, main healthcare organizations, really global healthcare organizations, they were kind of dabbling in telemedicine, was kind of out on the fringes. But that fringe came to the center really, really quickly. And so that's such a education and a teaching for us that we have to pay attention to what's going on in the fringes, because we don't know how quickly our environment's going to change. I mean, certainly in the field of education, where I work at USC Marshall Exec Ed, and in the business school, the amazing pivot we had to do in order to take everything from being on campus to online and having to create interactive and really meaningful curriculum. I mean, education just went through like the most radical transformation. We were all waiting like, oh, digital is going to come and affect the field of education, but wow, it accelerated it tenfold.
So, if you're in an organisation that isn't curious culturally, and you're in a leadership position, how do you change that culture? How do you encourage others around you to have that curiosity and to allow it in you as well?
Fundamentally, it comes down to what are you modeling? So if we're saying we embrace creativity and curiosity, and you are actually modeling top-down decision-making, preference for the status quo, not making any room for creative exploration time, and you're isolating people for non-conventional and non-conformist thinking, you're not going to encourage curiosity. So it really comes down to what are you modeling? And what is the environment that you're creating that allows for learning zones where we have a learning culture, right? We are iterating, we're failing. I mean, Intuit has failure celebrations. They actually
Yeah.
celebrate failures.
Yeah, that's
What
something
if we
I
all
talked
did
about
that?
in I talked about that in Just Ask, and it raised a few eyebrows. We talked about fail fests. Very
Yeah,
similar idea.
yeah. I have a colleague who's the former president of Sony Home Entertainment, and every quarter he was like, bring your best failure and let's talk about it,"
Yeah.
because they were constantly experimenting as entertainment was moving to the digital and streaming world. I mean, you also see in Microsoft, right? Look at that culture change where they went from a know it all culture
Yeah.
to a learn it all culture. I mean, I just talked to a VP at Microsoft recently where he said, Allison, 6 years ago, you had to know. You had to get it right. You had to be the expert. And today, when we get asked a question and somebody says, I don't know, we say thank you and we work on it together.
That's
So
so
it's
refreshing to
really,
hear.
yeah, isn't it? And Novartis has, in the last 3 years, has gone through a culture transformation because they dedicated, the C-suite dedicated themselves to bringing curiosity into the culture where employees are expected to have 100 hours of learning every year. And they constructed LMS and other tools. They use technology to enable it. And that's the other thing is like, how are we using technology to enable the curiosity? So another example at Microsoft is, they're trying to use technology through Teams and other formats that so if you, Andy, in the UK are working on a particular issue, the AI knows that you are and says, hey, have you checked out Allison's project over in the States, and have you connected with her? Because maybe there's something there that you could share and learn.
I think that's a really important thing. 'Cause it's something I've been talking to a lot of my clients about over years. Is what are you doing to break down those silos and those inefficiencies where people, it doesn't have to be internationally, people in the same building are working on the same project and not aware of it. We talked about sales teams earlier, and I've worked a lot on referral strategies over the years, and it's amazing how many people scrabble around for the introduction that one of the colleagues 2 desks away knows the right person,
Right.
and they have not got a clue about it. So picking up that digital thread and running with it a bit further. Sounds like awful corporate jargon, doesn't it? That'll be in a Dilbert cartoon, that phrase, one day. What about social media? You've talked about internal networks like Teams, and there are many examples of that. But what about LinkedIn? What about Twitter? How is that enabling our curiosity, or is it in fact stifling it?
I think it does both. You know, you and I connected through social media, through LinkedIn. We
Yeah.
got to meet each other and connect, and here we are talking and exploring things together. I think that's why social media is so great in that way. It can open up our horizons, um, connect with people that we would never be able to connect. I mean, I think that's one of the positives of the pandemic in that we all had to go virtual, but it opened up our worlds. Literally, you could present, right, Andy, to somebody in Australia or Singapore, in the same week, and you got to connect. Um, and it gives us an opportunity to open
I've just lost your sound. I don't know if you can hear me. Right, if you are listening, if you can comment and just say whether you can hear me. Okay, Alison, can you hear me? But
Yes,
I've
can you
lost.
hear?
You're back. You're back. Yes. So, you were talking about how we can connect with people and deliver presentations in different countries on the same day. But in terms of social media, can it get in the way of curiosity? Can it stop us being curious? So, for example, the challenge of social perfectionism, looking good online, does that get in the way of us saying I don't know and can you help me?
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Are you okay?
I can. There's a bit of feedback,
Mm.
so I don't know if your phone's coming through, but yeah,
So, okay.
yeah,
Uh, so social media, on the other hand, right, because of the algorithms and the AI, it really we only get served up what we're searching, and then that just confirms our beliefs. I mean, we saw the detriment that that does to our political system in the U.S. It's fed the polarization and the divide, and it really reinforced our stereotypes. So, our cultural truths we tend to embrace, and we don't question, and then our stereotypes are held on in even stronger. And so it's really upon us to think about, what is this information coming towards me? And am I just getting served up to reaffirm what I believe, or am I really opening up my horizons? And it takes an intentionality. I have to make an intention to watch, to read the Twitter feed of news outlets that I probably don't really subscribe to, but I would like to see another perspective, and try to understand, or not necessarily do I have to agree with it, right? I just have to have an intentionality to it, and have a willingness to hear it, and then I can decide what to do with it.
yeah. Those bubbles have affected us in the UK as well, with a lot of polarization, and I think yeah, it's become a major issue. I'm getting a bit of the feedback again from my voice. So what I might do is turn my speaker down when I'm speaking, and then back up again when you do. So a couple more questions for you on this part of the interview. Let's focus in on professional relationships and the role of curiosity in developing strong professional relationships. How you've talked about the authenticity and the courage, and I think that leads to some real connection between people. You talked much earlier about how curiosity can lead to more collaboration. Can you talk a little bit more to how being curious can help you develop a relationship from a simple exchange of, let's say, respect, to where you genuinely like and trust people, and get to a point where they're going to support for you and advocate for you?
So you're talking about kind of in, engaging in a way that kind of can open up the dialogue initially when we're doing our initial meets and greets, or building the relationship.
I think either. I think both.
Yeah. Andy, I'm sure that you probably advise us when you're working with clients. You talk about building social networks. You fundamentally have to have a genuine interest in connecting, right? And that there has to be some kind of service orientation in terms of, like, what it's not just about what am I going to get out of it. Well, what are we going to get out of this? And my study participants were pretty clear when they made it about how can this be a good experience for the other person, that they got a lot more of a meaningful connection and value exchange from that scenario. For just going in to ask questions to get information to satisfy our own agenda, people feel that they're gonna be closed off, and um, they're not going to be so keen on being open and collaborating with you. But if you're really like, hey, it's so interesting what you're doing, can you tell me more about that? And getting to know about them as a human, what they're working on, their interests. Like, we want to have an opportunity to really connect on different levels. It's not trying not to make it so transactional. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, because, as you say, it's exactly what I teach. So it hits the spot for me, and it makes me wonder how. So I'm going to turn my speaker down again because I'm echoing back. it makes me wonder how the remote world, the remote communications are impacting our abilities to make that connection. It's one of the things that I talk about with a lot of clients, because if I'm trying to make eye contact with you, as for those watching this live, I am now because I'm looking at the camera. I'm not making an icon. I'm not genuinely making eye contact because you're in my peripheral vision, and I've actually dragged your picture underneath my camera so that you're as close to it as possible. But if I look at your camera elsewhere on my screen, we feel disengaged. So it will feel like I'm not interested in you. And I often quote Dale Carnegie, the Swedish sound training man is the sound of his own name. You know, we want to feel people are genuinely interested in us. So that is absolutely, it hits the spot for me, and it's absolutely key. Where do you think we are as a society generally, taking aside the difficulties with engaging remotely? He says as he's got one hand on his volume to avoid the feedback. Taking aside all of those challenges, how do you think we are as a society? You touched on the challenges on social media and bubbles of news and bubbles of information and ideas. We've seen extreme political polarization in the US. We've seen it in the UK. I'm sure we're not the only countries that are experiencing this. These are just the ones that are on our radars because of where we live. Generally, how are we curious as a society, or do we need to do better?
It's such a great question, and such an existential, philosophical question. You know, I think there's always pockets of society that are curious, right? This is where our innovation comes from, and we see remarkable progress. And it's always so interesting to me, Andy, that when you read about kids who just create things, right, and out of nothing, and just because they saw a need and then they went and they figured it out, and it gives us such inspiration and hope. And I'm like, that's so beautiful, because they weren't about getting it right. They were just about going and trying different things to solve it. And I think as we move through society and we're so conditioned, right, to conform and to be and to show up a certain way and to hold on to our beliefs, that there's always going to be elements of society that want to hold on to what is and not be open to change. And then there's going to be aspects of society that want to see change, you know, want to see a more inclusive world, want to see the injustice that we see, the racial and social injustice, eradicated. And so I think it's incumbent upon each of one of us, right? We're not, you, Andy, and I, we're not going to change radically the world, but we can certainly make an impact in our immediate world. And being intentional about that. This is why you do your trainings. This is why, you know, you're rethinking, like, oh, wow, I just showed up as the expert. I really need to be the explorer here. And just touching people in that way, and just think of the exponential effect that then that has. So it's, you know, the question is, you know, what can you be doing in your immediate world? How are you showing up in your relationships in a way that says, hey, I really want to connect with you?
And I guess the starting point is by being more curious. So, Alison, thank you so much for joining me. You're going to join me again for our Thursday podcast and talk about the role of professional relationships in your career and some of the books that have really inspired you along the way. But for the moment, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy.
Great. Okay, so we were up and down. I don't know why we suddenly got all of that feedback.
Well, my headphone died, which makes no sense, because I charged it all night, and then I was looking for my other headset because I want to put it into the computer.
Oh, great. Do you want to switch that now before we start recording the second podcast?
Yeah, thank you.
If you joined us and you're watching, say hello. You've all been very quiet today. I know you're out there. I can see it on my screen. Just so if it's the first time you've listened to this, then just to let you know that we've recorded the first interview that goes out on the Monday. It's about 2 or 3 weeks time, I think. And then what we're going to do now is record a shorter interview. It comes out on the Thursday. This is what we do every week. And these are 3 set questions that I ask every time. Sometimes there's an additional question if an answer leads us down a different path. But we have the 3 typical as the template. So Alison, are we all plugged in and ready to go feedback free?
No, not yet.
We're still working on that.
So, no.
Just so that you know, if you are posting lots of comments and wondering why I'm not seeing them, you might be watching this after we've recorded live. I've noticed a few times people saying hello to me and joining in live as if it's live and not realizing that we posted this sometime earlier. So it's currently 5:20 in the UK on Thursday the 20th of May. But whenever you're watching this, I hope that you're finding it interesting. I think that was a fascinating conversation from my perspective. Next Friday, I will be speaking to Jane Gunn, who is a mediator, over 20 years of experience on mediation. I think that's at 10 a.m. UK time next Friday. So that will be the 28th, I think, of May. And Jane and I will be talking about how you resolve conflicts within professional relationships, and how you move forward when you don't see eye to eye. So that's a date for your diary. That'll be 10 o'clock for another live stream on the Connected Leadership podcast. Let's hope Alison can hear me without feedback. That's sounding quite positive. I'm not hearing feedback. So we've got the other headset plugged in now. Yes, excellent. Okay, so we're going to go straight into the opening question of the second podcast. I'll record an intro separately. So the opening question is looking at the professional relationships that have had a positive impact on your career to date.
Well, I'm going to flip that on its head a little bit, Andy, if you don't mind, with a different way to answer it, because in reflecting on that, I actually think it's the lackluster bosses who had the biggest impact on me. I didn't always have great leaders and people to look to, and they really taught me how I didn't want to show up. And they really got me curious about myself, about how I was interacting with others. It was really clear that I had to be clear about what my leadership brand was going to be about, what I really felt was aligned and authentic to me. And, we had talked earlier about strong leadership, being right, and that's actually totally the wrong definition. And, in my career journey, I was known as the one that could fix things. I was a fixer. I could get the team galvanized to fix things and to know. But you know what my 360 told me, Andy? I was arrogant. And so I didn't want to be arrogant because I had arrogant bosses. And I think all those experiences really informed the way I worked on myself, because we have to get curious about ourselves before we can really get curious about how we engage with the world.
I think I can. That resonates with me so much because I went through a similar experience. I was saying to someone the other day how it's ironic that I've written a book and I host a podcast on professional relationships, because in my 20s they were a car crash because I was arrogant, and it took other people to really open my eyes and let me see that the way that arrogance was holding me back. And hopefully, I try not to be so arrogant as to say I'm not arrogant anymore, which is a bit of a funny situation to be in. And hopefully I'm not. And hopefully that shows through. But yes, it's important that we learn from our failings, and people are strong enough to tell us. I had a client call this afternoon, and I was explaining how yesterday I was working with a former client who was a colleague of these clients, and I worked with his team for the first time. And this particular client, whenever I work with a team, always asks me in front of them all, how did we do? What feedback can you give us? Now, of course, when you work with a team for the first time, you want to sugarcoat it. You want to say how wonderful they are. But that felt inauthentic to me. and actually they were a pleasure to work with, but my point was I couldn't see 2/3 of them, and maybe that said something that they weren't stepping forward on the Teams call and engaging. And I was saying that I can't give feedback. I'm not a big fan of the praise sandwich as an example. You did this really well, but you could improve this, but you did this really well, because I don't think it allows people to grow. I know there are good psychological reasons for it being in place, but I think it's got lost somewhere in translation. So yeah, other people sharing with us is absolutely key, and those are positive relationships for me. You said you turned that on the head, but for me, people giving you that 360 and giving you that honest feedback allowed you to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. And inviting people to give you the feedback, right? So when we're working with executives, and in my work, I ask them, can you set yourself up with an accountability circle and let the people know what you're working on, because it shows that you're not perfect, and you are able to show that vulnerability and say, hey, I'm working on this too, which then reinforces trust with the team. But it also gives permission to people to give you the feedback, and it's a safe way to give feedback. And it is so important for us to be consistently asking for feedback, to check where we are, because otherwise we get in our little information bubbles or in our narratives, and we all have blind spots, and they're a reason that they're blind spots. You can't see them, and you need other people to point them out.
So I know that if I was saying the same thing in a workshop, someone would ask me. So I'm going to ask you the question on their behalf. How how do you ask for feedback about your own performance without A, appearing needy, or B, making the other person uncomfortable? And how do you recognize when they're not comfortable giving you that feedback and know when to back off?
I think it starts with who you ask. So, my recommendation is ask the friendlies. that are going to give you honest feedback, and who you trust would give the feedback in a way that it's in your best interest. And then it's presenting it in a way saying, hey, this is something I'm working on. Would you feel comfortable? Just ask, would you feel comfortable giving me feedback? And if they're humming and hawing and saying, okay, I get a sense that I've maybe put you on the spot, can you tell me more about that?
I think
And
if
maybe,
you ask if you ask the friendlies, I
yeah,
think one of the most important things is that you reassure them that it's okay to not be friendly in the free. It's not being friendly, but to be
yeah,
brutal
but
with you.
my I guess my implicit uh, communication in that is that the friendly is going to be direct and honest with you,
Yeah.
and is doing it in a way that it's for the highest potential outcome for you and for the collective, right? So, hey, Alison, I noticed that you shut that person down. You probably didn't mean to, but just be on the lookout for that, because I know you're working on trying to be a more inclusive leader in terms of integrating multiple perspectives. I mean, yeah, that's great feedback. That was direct, and that was honest, and you caught me, right?
A quick story I'd love to share here because it goes straight to this point. When I wrote my last book, Just Ask, the first three drafts were a disaster. They weren't right. And the publisher had said to me, this isn't working. And my relationship with the publisher was deteriorating at this point. So I did what I was writing about, and I asked my network, and I went to a good friend of mine who was a guest on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, Paul McGee, who's a very well-known author, very successful author. And I said, Paul, I would really appreciate your feedback. And when he came back to me, he said, I didn't want to give you my honest feedback, but Helen, who is his wife, said I had to. And it was Paul's feedback
Yeah.
that was so important, and he didn't feel comfortable doing it initially, so that was, I think, why that point. But I love the fact that we talked on the Monday podcast about curiosity, and that was our focus. And we go straight into being curious about yourself, which we didn't talk about on Monday, and is such a key part of it all. So thank you for that. So you've talked about how what some might term negative and what some might not like the use of that word, let's call it constructive feedback, helped you in a positive way. And part of the premise of this Thursday podcast is that where relationships go wrong is a learning process for us as well. So can you share an example of where relationships haven't worked out, and what you've taken away from that experience?
Yeah, I think, are you talking professional relationships, or I can touch on personal relationships?
You can touch
too?
on personal if you like, absolutely. If we can learn from
Yeah, because our past does tend to inform how we show up. I mean, my father abandoned us when I was 8. And so follow through and trust is a really important to me. And I think I looked to certain relationships, professional and personal, to fill certain voids and to fill certain areas in me that I hadn't really contemplated and filled for my own. And it's really true. Like, we have to heal ourselves, and we have to recognize where we really stand in our own talents, gifts, and abilities, and how to bring those forward, and don't expect somebody else to figure that out for us. And I think a lot of times in our organizations, we expect our bosses to have our career paths all figured out for us. And it's not true. Like, it's on you. It's on you. Like, I had to really own my career. I had to build relationships. I mean, talk about building relationships. I had to build stakeholder relationships up, down, across, because I knew that my bosses tended to be in their own survival mode, and they weren't looking out for me, right? And so just having that experience both in childhood and in professional development really helps you to create such a strong foundation for how you want to get curious about yourself and how you engage in the world and the impact that you want to make. So I have a very strong service orientation. It makes me curious about how I can do that in the world.
I think that's great, and it's a really important reflection on how other people's interactions with us impact the way we are with relationships going down the line further into our future. And the flip side of that is the way someone is with you, maybe nothing to do with you, but issues that they've had or bad experiences that they've had in the past. Vanessa Hall from Australia, who specialises in trust, shared with me how people trust in different ways or distrust in different ways based on their experiences. And I think it's so easy to put our own values, you talked about values in the Monday podcast, to apply our own values to the way others behave towards us. And they don't necessarily always align.
Yeah. I mean, we talked also in the podcast, how curiosity is so essential to sales teams or really any service organization. And I actually do programs around client centricity with the tenets of curiosity, managing our cognitive biases, and empathy. And I actually have people take their most challenging client, because, those are the ones that we say, oh, they don't get it. They never get it. And we totally shut down. We don't try to co-create or understand them. And it's literally a map of what that client sees, what they do, what they hear, what's in their world, their pains, their gains, like really immersing themselves in that client. And, 10 out of 10 times, the response is like, wow, I really had no idea what they're going through. And I have a whole different lens now, and I can think of a different approach of how I want to engage with that client.
It is, I talked when we were talking about sales about reading a script. You have to know who's on the other end of the phone. You have to know who you're talking to, and that's how you make sure your message resonates with people, and you can build rapport from that perspective. Finally, I always ask my guests to share the books, the podcasts, the TED Talks, whatever resources it might be that have most inspired them or helped them on their journey. So what are you going to suggest that our listener reads or listens to or watches?
So I have some old favorites of mine that are more on kind of investigating yourself. So I love The Fable of the Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. If you've never picked it up, I read it. If you've never read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, read it. I've actually watched videos of him. It's pretty amazing. And then, more recent books, pick up Adam Grant's Think Again. It's all about what we talk about in terms of curiosity and connecting. TEDx, I love Susan David's work on emotional agility, and podcasts. Who doesn't love a little bit of Brene Brown now and then?
Some very powerful recommendations there for anyone looking who hasn't come across Viktor Frankl's work. Man's Search for Meaning is a phenomenal book. I would put it amongst my top personal development books. Be careful, because when you look it up, you'll also come across Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning, which is extracts from speeches he gave and isn't in the same class, in my opinion, and is a much tougher read. So you're looking for Man's Search for Meaning, not Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. If you want to explore deeper, then move on to that. But I found that a much harder read. Fantastic, Alison. Thank you so much. I think both conversations have been really fascinating. I think exploring curiosity is so important, and it's not something we talk about that often as a topic. We might touch on, but not even that. And you've sold it. I don't think I needed much selling to, but you've sold it as hopefully to the people listening to this and watching this as something that we need to be focusing on a lot more. And it helps build our relationships. It helps leaders, and some great stories on today's podcast as well. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
So thank you, Alison, for joining me. Thank you for joining, whether live or afterwards on the live stream. As I said, next Friday at 10 o'clock, I'm being joined by Jane Gunn. We've got some more really great interviews being lined up. I've got a very exciting call tomorrow evening, and another one coming up in a week or two with some brilliant guests that I'm looking forward to introducing you to on the podcast. The Connected Leadership Podcast is going from strength to strength. Do let me know if you're enjoying it. Your feedback back means the world. I don't like broadcasting to a wall. I like to know it's resonating, and that feedback has been increasing over recent weeks. And it also means the world if you are telling other people about it. So share it on your social media, point people my way, post a review on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts. It helps other people find this in a very crowded market. I hope you'll agree that we're bringing something of value to the world and to people in business. And if you can help spread that word, I'd really appreciate it. But for now, thank you for joining me on the Connected Leadership Podcast. I'll see you again soon.